All right, so here we're diving deep into a sermon about King Ahaz, but it's not your typical good king, bad king story.
No.
Yeah, this one like really goes deep into like what was going on behind all the religious stuff during his reign. It's intense. We're talking 2 Kings 16, 2 Chronicles 28.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that this sermon is saying the issue wasn't actually a lack of worship at all.
Really?
Yeah, there was a lot of like religious activity going on, but the sermon says it's more about like devotion being misplaced, what people chose to put their faith in.
Okay, so it's more about the motivation behind it than just like going through the motions.
Exactly. And to show that point, the sermon starts by looking at King David, who's held up as like the ultimate example of a king who truly wanted God's presence.
Yeah, David, like the golden boy, right? But what makes him so different? I mean, didn't all the kings back then claim to be on God's side?
Well, the sermon really highlights how David's actions showed how much he yearned for God. Like right when he became king, one of his first things he does is to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel. It's like his first executive order, right? A big statement about what really mattered to him.
Wow, so it's not just talk. He's putting action behind his beliefs. So what else did he do?
He was super passionate about building a permanent place for God, a temple to show that God was present with the people.
Yeah.
And even though David wasn't allowed to build it himself, he started getting all the materials ready, like showing how dedicated he was to this.
So David is this super passionate worshiper. Sets a high bar, right?
Right.
Then we have Ahaz. Things totally change.
Yeah.
A sermon talks about how he shuts down the temple, puts out the lamps, basically stops all the rituals.
Oh, wow.
Totally opposite of David.
It's like a complete 180.
Yeah.
And there's this really powerful verse in 2 Chronicles where Ahaz's own son, Hezekiah, talks about how the people had completely turned away from God's dwelling. It really shows how far they'd strayed from the faith.
Okay, so we have David, the super passionate worshiper, and Ahaz, who seemingly rejects it all. What happened in between? Did they just totally forget about God?
Well, that's where the sermon gets really interesting. It says they didn't have a worship problem. They had a love problem.
What?
They were worshiping, but not the God of Israel.
Wait, so they're still religious, but their heart isn't in it. They're worshiping for the wrong reason.
Exactly. And the sermon makes a point of saying that Ahaz's heart wasn't against worship itself, just against worshiping the God of Israel.
Okay.
He seemed to see faith as a transactional thing, like something you do to get something back in return.
So it wasn't about like truly being devoted. It was about what he could get out of it.
Yeah.
Like making a deal with God.
Yeah. There's this line in 2 Chronicles where Ahaz makes sacrifices to the gods of Damascus. He's hoping they'll help him win a battle. Shows how far he'd gone from actually wanting a connection with God.
It's like he's shopping around for the God who will give him the best deal.
Right.
It makes you wonder, like, what was going on with him? Was he afraid, power hungry, or did he just not believe in the God of Israel anymore?
That's such a good question. It makes you think about how we can sometimes be drawn to easier types of faith.
Oh.
Ones that don't make us change or deal with our own problems.
You mean like cherry picking what we like to believe instead of fully going all in on something that might ask more of us?
It's something to consider because the sermon goes on to describe how Ahaz falls even deeper into this kind of messed up worship, way beyond just making deals with other gods.
It gets worse. I mean, abandoning your own God seems pretty bad already.
Yeah.
Worse might be putting it lightly. The sermon describes it as Ahaz going on like this full-blown idolatry spree.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about like making an offering here or there to another god. This is something else entirely.
It's like he trades one form of worship for like a whole bunch of them.
Right.
But they're all coming from this much darker place. The sermon describes him making images of Baal and even setting up altars to Molech. And that might have even meant child sacrifice, which is...
Oh gosh, child sacrifice. That is just awful. I can't even imagine that kind of cruelty, especially from someone who's supposed to be leading his people.
Yeah, it really shows how far off you can go when you're devoted to the wrong things. And it gets even weirder when you remember that he shut down the temple.
Yeah.
But then goes and does all these other much more messed up forms of worship. It's like he's trying to fill some kind of emptiness, but going about it totally the wrong way.
It really makes you wonder if he thought these other gods were more powerful, if they were more likely to give him what he wanted. Or maybe he was trying to cover all his bases, worship everyone just in case. But if he was so worried about getting results, about what he could get from these gods, it makes you wonder what he was so scared of. What was he trying so hard to avoid?
That's a really good point. It makes you think, was it fear or ambition? Or maybe, like you said, he just wasn't sure about his own faith anymore, didn't trust the God who'd always been there. It's something we can see even today. People chasing after easy answers, quick fixes, anything that promises to solve their problems without asking much of them.
It's like we want the easy way out, even when it comes to our beliefs. We want the good parts of faith without having to do any of the hard work.
Yeah.
But the sermon keeps going. It describes this really symbolic event with Ahaz moving the altar in the temple.
Oh, right.
And this is where it gets really interesting because this isn't just about adding new idols. This is Ahaz changing how people worship, like the actual structure of it.
I see what you mean.
Yeah. So can you remind me about this altar? Didn't he see some fancy one when he was in Damascus and then decide he just had to have one like it?
That's right. He gets totally fixated on this altar he sees while visiting Damascus. So he tells them to build him one just like it. And then he puts it right at the front of the temple and moves the original bronze altar off to the side.
So he's not just adding a new altar. He's like replacing the old one.
Yeah.
And putting this new foreign one right in the center. That seems like a really big deal symbolically.
It is. The sermon really dives into that symbolism. You see, the bronze altar represented atonement, the idea of sacrifice and making things right with God.
Right.
It was a central symbol of their covenant with God, and we can even see it as pointing towards the sacrifice of Christ.
So when he pushes aside the bronze altar, Ahaz is basically rejecting the whole point of his faith. He's turning his back on the very thing that connects him with God.
Exactly. And it gets even worse. He has the priest Uriah move the bronze altar over to the north side of the temple, basically hiding it.
The north side. Is that significant?
The sermon suggests that putting it to the north was done on purpose to make it seem less important. The north side was often seen as a place of darkness, a place where God wasn't present.
So he's not only replacing the altar, he's trying to get rid of the symbol of his faith completely. It's like he's rewriting history.
Yeah.
Trying to make his own version of religion where the old rules don't matter. But why go through all that trouble? What was so bad about the original altar?
Well, remember how we talked about how we all want to take the easy way out?
Yeah.
Well, the sermon thinks that Ahaz might have liked idolatry because it didn't make him be accountable or commit in the same way that worshiping the true God did. With these other gods, he could make offerings without actually having to change how he acted or deal with his problems. It was a religion without consequences, a way to seem religious without doing any of the hard work of repentance and changing your ways.
That's a really powerful idea. It's like he made a God that looks like him, one that demands obedience, but doesn't ask him to really change. It makes you think about our own lives, about the things we hold on to that keep us from fully surrendering to God.
Absolutely. It's easy to get so caught up in the outward stuff of faith that we forget about what's going on inside. The sermon asks this really hard-hitting question. If there was no help, if there was no blessing, if there was no gift, would there still be love?
Wow. That's a tough one. It makes you really think about why you believe what you believe. Are we looking to God for who he is, or are we just trying to get something out of it? Are we willing to love him even when it's hard, even when things don't go our way?
Exactly. And this idea of ignoring the truth about God, even though it's all around us, that connects to something Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25.
Here, let's talk about that. What does Romans say about Ahaz and all these false gods?
Okay, so in Romans, Paul is talking about how people suppress the truth about God, even though it's everywhere you look in creation itself.
Right.
He's saying we can't pretend we don't know about God because his fingerprints are all over everything.
Right.
But even so, people choose to ignore that truth. They trade it for a lie. They worship the things that were created instead of the one who created them.
So it's like Ahaz is choosing to be blind to the truth. He'd rather focus on these fancy new altars and these foreign gods than acknowledge the God who has always been there.
Right.
The God who led his people out of slavery. The God who made the very covenant that he's now rejecting.
It's a powerful connection. It makes you think about what are those altars we're building in our own lives? What things are we putting front and center, even though they might be pushing God away?
That's such a great question. It makes me think about all the stuff we get caught up in. Our jobs, our things, our comfort, even our fears.
Yeah.
Those can become like idols. They demand our time and energy and, even our worship.
And that's the sneaky thing about idolatry. It's not always about bowing down to a statue. It can be anything we put ahead of God in our hearts, anything we care about more than our relationship with him.
Okay, so we've got David, whose heart was totally set on being close to God, and then Ahaz, who seems to be running the other way, building altars to everything except the God of Israel.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big difference. But like, what does this mean for us today? How do we make sure we're not building those metaphorical altars to the wrong things?
Well, that is the big question, isn't it? And I think this sermon actually gives us some hints. Remember how it talked about how David and Ahaz had such different motivations? David was all about getting closer to God, building a home for the divine.
Yeah.
But Ahaz seemed more interested in what he could get, like military victories or safety, or maybe even just feeling in control.
Right. It's like David was trying to build a relationship and Ahaz was trying to make a deal. So how do we change that?
Yeah.
How do we go from that what can I get way of thinking to something more genuine,
Yeah.
like a real loving connection with God? I mean, it's easy to say put God first, but how do you actually do that when life is so crazy and there's so many distractions?
Yeah, it's not easy, that's for sure. But I think recognizing that our relationship with God isn't a trade-off is a good place to start. It's not about earning points or bargaining for good things. It's about being open to a love that can change us, that pushes us to grow, and that calls us to something bigger than ourselves.
Okay, but that whole transformation thing can be kind of scary, right? I mean, Ahaz seemed terrified of facing his own flaws,
Yeah.
of letting go of control. He'd rather build 100 altars than actually change. So how do we deal with that fear, that resistance to change?
You've hit on something really important. Ahaz not wanting to be held accountable reminds us that true spiritual growth requires us to be honest with ourselves and humble. It means facing the parts of ourselves we want to hide, even from God. It means admitting that we need forgiveness and grace.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about letting ourselves be made better, letting God smooth out those rough edges.
Exactly. And that takes a level of trust that can be hard to find, especially if we've been hurt or disappointed in the past. But God's love isn't based on what we do. He meets us right where we are in all our messiness and imperfection.
This is making me think about those altars we were talking about, the things we might be putting at the center of our lives without even realizing it. What are some ways we can tell if we're slipping into that what can I get mindset? Like if we're more focused on getting what we want than on really connecting with God?
That's a great question to consider. I think one sign is when our prayers sound more like a wish list than an actual conversation. Another is when we get so caught up in the rules and rituals that we lose sight of things like love, compassion, and justice.
Right. It's like going through the motions, but our hearts aren't in it. We're more worried about how things look than about truly changing. And I think that's the real challenge, isn't it? Figuring out what it means to have a real loving relationship with God when life is so busy and complicated.
Absolutely. It's a journey that lasts a lifetime. But looking at Ahaz's story has reminded us what can happen when we forget about that connection with God. It's a call to check our hearts, to see if anything's blocking our relationship with God, and to choose to put Him first.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what's the one thing you're hoping our listeners will take away from this conversation?
I'm hoping it'll make them want to do their own altar check, to ask themselves what's really most important to them. And if it's not God, what can they do to make space for Him, to build a relationship with Him that's based on love and trust and a willingness to change?
That's a powerful challenge. And it really makes me think, thanks for walking us through this deep dive. It's given me so much to consider.
It's been great. Just remember, the way back to God is always there. We just have to be willing to turn towards Him, to look for Him, and to let His love guide us.